Welcome to the Consummate Athlete Podcast, where we explore what it means to be a well-rounded, happy, goal-crushing athlete. Every week, myself, sports journalist Molly Herford, and cycling coach and kinesiologist Peter Glassford interview experts and chat through all of your training questions. We're excited to have you along for the ride.
Hello. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete Podcast. Peter, how's it going?
It's going well. Happy to be here. We have some fun topics today.
Yeah, and it seems like last week's both the test don't guess and the zone 2 question really struck a chord.
People love zone 2.
I think, you know what? I think that actually like PB'd on our Instagram. I think that might have been like the most liked post we've ever done, was talking about how I'm trying to think of the exact quote, but the gist was, we've spent years doing endurance rides with the occasional town line sprint or, surging up a hill and getting out of zone 2. And we've all managed to get reasonably fit doing that. That's, what pros have been doing for a billion years.
Sure. And when do we have to be specific, I guess, is the question you could maybe ask. But I think the reality is folks like talking about endurance training, but I don't think a lot of people like to do it. Is maybe the takeaway there. But there you go. We appreciate we had a couple of emails, we had a couple DMs, we had comments. So we appreciate all that. And yeah, if there's follow-up questions or similar questions, we welcome those.
Yeah. And before we get into today's question, which is sort of a bit of a...
Well, let's tease it. I think we should talk about these things right off the bat. It's probably good practice. What are we talking about today?
Well, today we're talking about really what to do with both with your testing. So last week we talked about, should you do any testing? And by that, we meant really more like lab testing, where you're talking about like going to a lab for like the VO2 max test, stuff like that. Or really any of those kind of like lactate
how to decide what to do in your training is the one question. And then we're going to look at heart rate strap troubleshooting today as well.
Yes, which is a very important topic for a lot of us who have spent, that time pre-ride just like absolutely furious. So I think a couple really good little tips and tricks about that.
Super.
All right. Before we get into it, quick shout out to our sponsor, AG1, formerly known as Athletic Greens. So we've been using AG1 for going on 2 years now. It's like the morning routine that I stick to as faithfully as I stick to my yoga core routine. And really just such an awesome product. I think this is the 53rd or 52nd iteration of it from when it first came out.
That's right. And it's not just a multivitamin. It has adaptogens. It has the greens, obviously.
Vitamins, minerals, probiotics, prebiotics, basically all of the good stuff in one thing, which is really the main reason we love it, is because it is your sort of one-stop shop for, you're looking for all of these supplements and all this stuff, but really it's so much simpler to just have the one thing that you trust, that you believe in.
The time we really appreciate is, we're on the road a lot. We like to travel. We like to be out in the van, and then sometimes the amount of vegetables you can carry on a longer road trip or on a camping trip or something like that is just not a lot. So something like this is a great backup.
Yeah. So that's also true for, the business types who are often at all of these, like long.
If you're in Vegas, this is for you.
Yes, absolutely. Just even like long days in the office where it's just not super easy. Like obviously we're major fans of the whole food approach to getting all your nutrients, but yeah, for the extra insurance of having that, for the days that things don't really go according to plan, it's just, fantastic. So you can check that out over at drinkag1.com/MollyH. If you do that, you get 5 free travel packs and a year supply of immune supporting vitamin D. So those are droplets. The travel packs, so convenient, so convenient. So definitely head over there and check it out. We'll put the link in the show notes. We appreciate if you use it. Again, drinkag1.com/MollyH. Okay. How to train. Now,
how to train.
Okay. What to train, how to train. I feel like we should caveat this by the classic, it depends.
Well, that's what we're trying to discuss.
But it depends. And also, this stuff can get really confusing. So definitely if you're listening to this and you're like, okay, I still don't really know where to go with my training, or like, maybe this would work, I'm not really sure. You can always head over to consummateathlete.com. You can book a consult and actually chat through what it is that you're doing with Peter, and maybe get some more ideas that are specific to test results you've had, or, where you're at with your training, what your goals are, that kind of thing.
Well, we'll try to work through some of the different frameworks, some of the fundamental questions. And it is one of those things where, the testing might be a part of this, but for a lot of people, could we start with, first principles or general principles? And then from there, if something like a phone consult is great because, we can take these patient information or patient feedback forms or whatever you want to call them, patient history, I guess is the word I'm looking for. And you can start sussing out, this is what always happens in races. This is, my experience. This is the goal I have. This is, I suck at sprinting, some of these things in our intake form, we call this, the demons, like what demons do you have? And so a lot of times that's where the answer is to what you should, work on as far as training. So yeah, we'll sort of work through some of that today.
Actually, this maybe leads to an interesting question about testing. Have you ever had someone test or seen someone who tested and they were shocked by the result? Because I think you just said something really interesting there of like, you tend to know that sprinting is not your thing, or you suck at sprinting or whatever, like you're aware of what your demons are. So does testing ever really reveal something like truly shocking?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, and I'm not someone who's tested that much in my life, but I would say for sure it does. I've seen a couple times, it's often where it's these people who have trained a lot and then you're sort of plateaued or you're not making progress for a reason. Sometimes that's where maybe it's not surprising, but it maybe gives you like a hint as to what, and what I've seen is things like, oh, this person's anemic, and, then you send them for blood test or something like that. But again, these are different types of tests, but I think so. I think you would see this sometimes, that it's maybe surprising, but yeah, that's where I get tricky with the testing, is that I think that's actually like a later step in most cases. Again, if you like testing, if it's available to you, you have the resources to do it, then do it. But for a lot of us, it's sort of starting at first principles of, endurance training and this sort of stuff. Are we getting those big rocks?
Love it. Okay. So where do we go?
Well, so we have, often when I try and answer questions, I always forget that, we have these 3 tenets, and those I think answer a lot of these questions. So maybe just reviewing those tenets, we have our 80, 90, 100. So 80% is a passing grade, right? Are you riding a bicycle? If you're training for bicycles, it's probably a bicycle thing you should be doing most days. So 80% is a passing grade. It doesn't have to be perfect for most people. If you're going to win the Tour de France, probably there's a lot of perfect in testing. For a lot of us, if you're starting from 0, the other concept that's related to this is that, anything works for 6 weeks, or everything works for 6 weeks, is a Dan Johns saying. And so I think that's the idea, is that most of us could follow a general sort of like plan and do all right with it. So 80% is a passing grade. And then 90% of life is showing up is the 90. And so this is the idea that you have to do it consistently. So if it's a hero workout today and you can't do anything for the next week, that's not every day. 90% of life is showing up. And we like to attach onto this, having your gear, having your Garmin charged, some of these other things that aren't even talking about training, but obviously make a difference when we think about showing up for your training. Okay. And then 100 is much of the training process is spent purposefully not going 100%. So you could call this the zone 2 discussion, but the idea is that you shouldn't be maxed out. They shouldn't be vomit workouts. They shouldn't, there should always be a little bit of slack or reps in reserve most of the time, right? We save it for race day.
Okay, perfect. Now, and those tenets, if you want to find, we'll include a link in the show notes just to our post on that really goes into depth on all 3 of them. And write them down, put them on your top tube if you need to, or put the one you need on your top tube.
So that might be enough to get, someone who isn't training consistently or isn't, getting out the door, and have confidence that whatever you're going to do, if you're starting at a lower level of fitness, because you haven't trained over the winter, or it's been a stressful time, or you're a new cyclist, or whatever, right? We all come back to this level of, getting out the door is the main thing. And even if it's a 20-minute ride, nothing in those principles, those 3 tenets said it had to be a 3-hour epic ride. That to you should mean a 10-minute ride where you maybe work on your wheel lifts or your braking, in the park, or just ride to work, commute. These are all going to be beneficial because you don't have that stimulus yet absorbed. Again, if you're in the Tour de France, this is different.
Right.
Yeah. So that's our first framework. What do you think about that? Do you think that's
I
useful?
think that's useful.
Okay.
Side note, if you're watching on YouTube, I apologize that DW has made an appearance for the second week in a row of just like needing to be in my lap for this episode.
Well, we're not back in our studio
No.
at home yet.
Well,
So
I was gonna explain. Yeah, we're not in our studio. We're in a remote location that literally only has one room. It's a tiny house that we're staying in. So our options are pretty limited for where to put him during the episodes. So he's quietest when he's on my lap. So he is on my
let's
lap.
see. Yeah, there's probably sounds of chewing or licking or something.
Apologies for that.
And anyhow, yeah. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can watch on YouTube. Yeah, I also have this cross training is not a crime shirt on, which you can get in the Consummate Athlete store. So there you go. It's not a crime. So we have that. So we have our tenets. The next little framework, we're going to sort of give you sort of mental models or frameworks here that might help. You can pick whichever one you like or whatever level you think you're on. So the other framework then that's helpful sometimes is this idea of frequency, volume, intensity. And so this roughly tracks, I used to say beginner, intermediate, advanced, but let's just say you're limited by frequency, you're limited by volume, you're limited by intensity.
And I like that framework actually more than I like beginner, intermediate, advanced, because I think people can come in and out of like how much volume like they're limited by, right? Like someone could be a super top level masters racer and then get a job promotion and for the next year, or they have like a huge project at work. So suddenly they might be considered an intermediate or even advanced racer or rider, but they're now kind of as time limited as a beginner.
Right. And that's exactly it, is that you're going to go in and out of these. So if you come out of your off season, you go on vacation, you come back, then getting back riding 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30-minute spins is going to be beneficial for a little while. You're going to quickly go through that. But as a beginner, it's the frequency. So a lot of times what I'll see is people will come, they ride, they were going to spin class and, maybe they would ride a bicycle in some form, inside or outside, 3 days a week. So to make that person faster, you need to figure out a way to get them riding 5 or 6 days a week. We still take our off day, general principles. But the frequency is going to be the biggest thing. It almost doesn't matter, in my opinion, like again, 10, 20, 30-minute rides. If the frequency of the practice of the skill of riding a bike is done, they're going to get faster. And that's really your question. I want to train. How should I train? How do I decide how to train? Well, think about it. If you're not training frequently, that is a place that you might be able to get better, right? So let's try that. If it doesn't work in 6 weeks, we'll try something else. So that might be adding a commute. That might be adding, a little spin here or there in the morning. You're going to figure out how to fit this into your life. We think cross training could be part of that too, but let's keep it simple and thinking towards, you're a cyclist, you're a runner. Can you do the thing more frequently? Once you're doing that, you can say, yes, I've gone away and I've trained for 6 to 12 weeks and I've been very consistent training, 5, 6 times a week. Then we're more concerned, are you getting that volume in, which, you could boil down, I think, for most people to, are you getting sort of a 90-minute ride and a 3-hour ride, something like that into this, certainly more can often be better, but most of us don't have that time. And what I see with most masters, again, we should qualify this. We're not talking about Tour de France. We're not talking about 20-year-old superstars. We're talking about people with, work, family, blah, 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 life. It's not easy when I say this to get that 90-minute ride midweek and that ride on the weekend, around 3 hours. It doesn't have to be every week, but that's the idea. And there's certainly more you could do, but I think that's like a rough idea. So you're riding 5, 6 days a week, and now we're looking at volume. You could probably tie in things like your moderate efforts, your tempo, your sweet spot, that sort of stuff into something like that around volume. We're time limited, so you're going to have to do a bit more of that stuff. But yeah, it's just really, are you riding your bike now longer to start developing endurance? So we could call this zone 2 and endurance training, sort of big rocks of doing well at endurance sport is training more hours. So that's that next piece. Now, at some point, you're going to become, I'm riding enough, and we have to always say, what is enough? We don't know. But that's where I think, maybe even testing and stuff, this next level where we get to intensity is thinking more. Now we have to be very specific about what is zone 2. This is the person that, that strict, intensity discipline, this is an easy ride, so that this 1 or 2 or 3 days a week, I can really push the envelope and do the intervals that I'm supposed to do, right? There's no like fuzziness. It has to be, this is, 3, 4, 5 easy days, and then 1 or 2 or 3 hard days, and they're very different days. And so this next level would be intensity. So the question is, when does that happen? And usually I'll give people, usually once you're training, towards the max of your volume and you've done it for a while, and that's what fits into your life, right? It's not always what physiologically your body could handle if you were a pro and you had no family and no work. This is in reality, you've been training and you can't really do much more. That would be where you could start looking more closely at the intensity and how that's distributed through the week. Often the people that it really matters for are those ones who are getting they're if we go into TSS world. Can we just assume that people know TSS in this rough thing?
No.
Oh, okay. So usually it's around somewhere in that around 100, if we just use big round numbers.
TSS stands for training stress score.
And what that usually means to me is like, you're probably training to get to 100, like you're going to be training 2.5, 3 hours a day, roughly, it could be a couple shorter days that are harder, but then you're going to have a lot of, so it's a lot of hours, like more hours than most masters would ever do, which is the point, sort of, right? Like it doesn't matter that much. Right. So that's somewhere in there. It could be 80, it could be 90, it could be 100. And that's just the average day that you have. So on average, you're riding between 2 and 3 hours a day. So I'll have some of my elite masters will get up into that 14 hours, something like that. And they might get close to that. And then again, that's where I think it starts mattering a bit more, that their easy days are easier. Easy enough. There's more strict with their zone 2. They're also getting fitter. So now we can be more particular about those zones, because the zones are also getting bigger. Yeah, I know there's a lot of terms there.
Yeah, I feel like you might have just gotten into the weeds a little bit there.
The important part is that most of us won't probably get to the point where that really matters, right?
Okay, so for most of us, like, don't look at our TSS score, which can be found on Training Peaks, by the way. Like, this is,
I feel like Strava and them, they all do different variations of it that are all the same.
Are they actually like
Pretty
all
much,
on the same scale?
pretty
Okay.
much, yeah. Yep.
Okay, so don't get too freaked out by your TSS or.
Well, the reality is, like, it's just time times intensity. So that's load, and that's all. It's just giving you an average of your load over the last 6 weeks. That's all, like your CTL or your quote unquote fitness score. And I don't know what Strava calls it, but it's something like fitness score. And that's all it's telling you is, on average for the last 6 weeks, this is what you've done. Does that make sense? So on average, and I often just will break it down to hours for people. So if we take your last 6 weeks and we average it across the 42 days, 6 weeks, 7 times 6, right? 6 weeks. What was the average hours you did? So you have an off day, you have the long day on the weekend. Maybe you had a long weekend and you did a little extra, but then you had a rest week and you did less. So what is the average? Most people, if you train 7 hours a week, you did 1 hour a day, right? And then averaged, across 6 weeks. So that would be most people, right? Most people are that under 8 hours a week. That's what they have, with an off day or 2 off days and then a long day on the weekend. And then they try and train 45 minutes or an hour during the week.
To be clear, you can actually do quite a bit with that. It's
That's
funny.
most people.
Yeah, and it's funny because, like, I think we're surrounded often by people who are, going to sort of the limits of like how much you can train. And this is even some of the moms I'm friends with are doing like super high volume for how busy their lives are.
Sure.
To the point where I start feeling really like stressed because my training isn't, often over like 12 hours.
Well, and runners are a little different.
Runners are
We'd have to scale this down on the runners, right? Because most runners, maybe that's an important point, are not training the same number of hours.
Yes, if you're a runner listening to this, please do not think
probably divide by 2, or maybe a little bit more than half. But yeah, like for example, like Molly is training at quite a high level and for a very 100-mile running, but probably your hours. What do you think? Maybe 12? Something like that?
Depends on what you're counting too, because if you're adding in like core and yoga and strength, it gives me a boost of a couple hours. But like if we're just talking straight running, then 10, 12.
Sure. And probably we would count what's training. So I always say, this is a whole other topic. We can do another podcast on what counts as training. Maybe that's a good one. We'll put that on the list. But yeah, I think all in, probably that's about right. And then I'm trying to train at a high level, and I've tried to hit like 8. We're in our base phase here, so we've been trying to hit I tried to hit 18. It's very hard to do that, but we had a long weekend here, so that's the difference with cycling, right? And I would say you're a higher level runner than I am cyclist.
I don't know about that, but
I'm trying to be like David's always like really. Yeah, Molly is the best athlete in the world.
If you missed that episode, go back to our Valentine's Day episode on February 13th
Trying to.
for our good friends David and Megan for a dose of positivity.
So all that to say, I think, intensity, it's not that intensity doesn't matter for those folks in the middle, but the challenge is always going to be fitting some hours into the week without pissing off your family, getting sick. There's always this balance. So you can do it, you can fit it in, but that's the challenge, is to find that reasonable balance. And then just in that sort of 4 to 6 weeks, 1 to 2 months, alternating the intensity that you're doing. And this is where just following the good old Joe Friel, linear periodization, as you ease through, is going to be very effective for most people, right? It is. It just pick something, do it for a little while, and then switch it up, but keep trying to get your endurance rides in. Does that make sense? So there's still, even when you're in that middle, wherever you are, if you're frequency, volume, you can still follow these plans. It's not that it's not important. It's just when you get to that more elite level, that is where not everything is going to work anymore is the problem, right? You're going to start hitting those peaks, but that isn't most of the people on this podcast, I imagine. The answer is usually try and figure out how you can ride, try and be consistent, try and not get sick, try and have good sleep.
And this is, really a lot of what we were saying last week as far as the testing went, and like our slight skepticism around it is so often people aren't hitting the big rocks of that, sleep, stress, frequency, etc.
Yeah, and we talked about on that testing podcast, again, testing's okay. Sometimes it can give you answers, and testing could mean any host of things, that whole spectrum from your power tests on your bike, your time trials, running, blood tests, it could be even some of the sleep data you're getting. Sometimes I'll look at that. Okay, well, your sleep data has never showed you've slept over 7 hours in a night. We assume that most people should sleep 7 to 9 hours. If you're trying to really, burn the candle at both ends and work and family and train a ton, why is it not 9? Because we know that's one of the biggest rocks.
Yeah, exactly.
I know my own training. I trained less, slept more, and was really careful. If I didn't sleep well, I didn't push it. And it's amazing. It took me 10 years of training to figure out that sleep was a big one for me, but there you go.
And it's funny, I'm working on an article around sort of myths around weight loss for runners for Canadian Running Magazine. And all 3 of the experts I talked to were like, yeah, it's really not diet. It's really not running. It's really sleep where you're going to make those gains. Like if you're not sleeping, you can pretty much kiss like body composition goals goodbye.
Sure. And that's the tough thing sometimes, is that interconnectedness. Sometimes I'll talk about a stool. The stool won't stand up if you don't have these things, right? So there's sleep and stress and food and movement, which we can include exercise underneath movement, because your walks and your fidgeting and your standing desk, these all contribute, but any of those can interact. And certainly sleep changes, the willpower, the motivation, the energy, and then also how we use the fuel too. So yeah, sleep is it's an important leg of the stool.
Okay. I think that pretty much covers our basic thing of frequency, volume, intensity.
Well, I thought maybe, where were you thinking next?
I was going to go on to your next point here about gap analysis.
Oh, okay. Sure. So then what we need to consider for all of these athletes, because at some point we are assuming you're going to go do something with your training. You're training for an event of some type. It could be a tour. It could be a big ride with friends. It could be the season of weekly races or group rides. We're not judging what the event is, the thing you're preparing for, the challenge, the big ride, the FKT, the bike pack adventure. We have all of these folks, but this is where we need to consider, what are you getting ready for? Because this is fitness that fit for the task. You may not need to get ready for a short track, 20-minute short track mountain bike race if you're getting ready for a 10-day bike packing adventure. So then when we look at the gaps and the limiters, it might not actually matter if you don't know how to sprint or stand up on your bike if you're bike packing for a long time.
Right. And it's funny, I was just doing an article for bicycling about what should your power output goals be. So I talked to Tim Cusack, who's a fantastic coach, creator of WKO, very big in the big data and analysis stuff. And what he and I were talking about is so often people get into the trap. Zwift has made this even worse. No offense to Zwift here, the FTP trap, where the only number that you really care about raising, especially with regards to power, is this FTP. You got to get your 20-minute test up, because otherwise your numbers are low. And I'm using quotes around that because that's the only metric that people really almost know about their power. But if you're doing a crit race, for example, your FTP actually does not really matter nearly as much as your sprint or your VO2.
or your just tactics. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
So we were talking about, really looking like when you're thinking about what your power output goals should be, stop focusing on the FTP number as the only power output goal.
Mhm.
Instead, look at what race you're doing, really like looking at the course and figuring it out. And the crits are a very obvious example, but uh, you know, looking at, are there long climbs where the pack tends to like go, someone starts attacking, like, okay, now we need to work. Maybe that actually is your FTP. Maybe it is, you're like, just depending on what the efforts are going to look like. That's, probably what we need to work on.
Sure. And so you could do that with power. Tim does a great job of looking at something like a crit race and seeing, on the 10th lap, there was this effort that's 30 seconds every single lap, and then you weren't able to hold it. And then, okay, now we can go and maybe train based off of that, or a certain duration we're trying to pull out of that. And that's a little more high tech for a lot of folks, especially if we are thinking more towards our off-road bike packing sort of people. You can do stuff like this with power from a mountain bike race, perhaps. But as it gets longer, I do think we're starting. The nice thing is that experience and preparation and gear, pacing, these things all become more important than that explosive, you could say, athleticism, skills. These things become a little more devalued, or less valuable as these other things start coming in. Gut, and just like your gut staying together. I always say with bike packing, are you terrified of the dark? So do you have experience in the darkness? Woods craft, or what is this? Something like that. Something where you can build a fire or whatever, right? It sounds odd, but these are start coming at the extremes of these other disciplines, can become really important. Now, to your point about the race analysis or the event analysis, this is where whatever the thing is you did, assuming you did it in the past, you can now look at it though and see what were the issues. And the bike packing people I work with are really good with this. Okay, this was too heavy. I didn't need this. I was getting really tired at this point. This food didn't work. And so they start going through this gaps analysis of, okay, on day 3, it got really hard. And why was it really hard? Okay, I didn't, carry enough food or take in the water. And so for them, it's almost more, the preparation, the fueling, the gear. But you could do the same thing in a mountain bike race. I'm good off the start, or I'm not good off the start. I had a guy I consulted with when I was racing. He didn't speak English super well, but that's what he asked. He said, "Are you ahead or are you behind at the start?" And I said, "Oh no, yeah, I'm not near the start or like near the front at all." He said, "Okay, well then you don't have speed."
There you go.
So, and so in the mountain bike race, that was an important thing, especially even more than at that time. Now it's super important to be able to be near the start. And so that gets into the start position. So how do we figure out, how do you stage higher up? That might be points, or, the getting to the start line earlier in some cases. And then can you start beside a bunch of people and do it really, really hard? So this gets into, you could test that power, sprint power, 3-minute, 5-minute power. But it could also just be a blanket, like, yeah, other people are faster at starting. I need to figure out how to get off the line. And for a lot of people, it's actually more technique than any sort of physiological power production. It's actually how do you go from standing still to getting going? And most people never practice that. So every interval that person does should be from a standing start, even if it's a 20-minute threshold. Just stop, put your foot down, race start, and then get into your threshold. So again, an example of where that's a gap. So you should be stopping and starting just constantly in that sort of niche example, but because the starts are so important. So that gap analysis, is really good. And again, we could take that to technical skill, anything, you get dropped in every single track in the race. Well, then why are we sitting on the trainer all of your training rides, doing zone 2, when the thing that you're getting beat on is the single track? You're the double track racing person that everyone gets mad at, because then you slow them down. There's that's the gap, right? And so sometimes it can sound harsh, but like, you're spending all this time training, but you only have so much time to train. So this is where looking at those limiters can be really, really powerful when we're trying to, again, the question today, decide what to do with your training.
Yeah. And we did actually a whole episode on gap analysis back in November. So we'll link to that in the show notes. But, in that one, we really got into all of the nuances like nutrition and mental performance and all of that as well. Because all of that also goes into this gap analysis. So I think point number 1 is like, figure out what the goal is you're working for. And again, it can be anything. It doesn't have to be a race. It's just that it's helpful to have some kind of carrot that like just forces you to be a little bit more specific. So even if you don't currently have a race on the schedule, just think about like a thing that you want to do that isn't something that you've done before, even, riding with the group that's like normally faster than you or whatever the heck it is.
Yep.
Going a distance you've never gone, whatever.
Setting up the environment. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
So like put that thing on, and then I think start making that kind of exhaustive list of the gap analysis, and also not feeling bad about like not looking at it as looking at it as neutrally as possible.
No, they're just
versus
opportunities, right? Again,
Yeah.
you only have so much time. So work on the thing, you want to keep working on your strengths. This is always the other thing is some people are, really good at riding for extended periods of time or have great endurance. That doesn't mean that, you should abandon that, but that doesn't take a lot of work. A lot of times you get almost like addicted to the thing you're really good at,
For sure.
but it doesn't take as much to maintain that stuff. I'll see a lot of people who are great endurance riders. They can ride for hours all day. They can finish something like Unbound, and it's not even that, it's a big effort, but it's not nearly the thing that it is for a lot of people. But, that can be maintained. That's where that 90 minutes and 3 hours, like it sounds really scary to some folks who are up in the like 5 and 7 hour rides, but you don't have to do that to maintain. You need to do it periodically. But if your race then is something like a 3-hour gravel race that's really intense and you're getting popped, every time the surges on all the climbs or the technical sections, the segments in it, this person, if that's the goal, then that's the goal, right? That's the gap. And so you maintain the strengths. You don't want to lose those. You can even make them stronger in some cases, but you do want to like shore up those gaps if they're
Right.
We call those critical moments. If you're not able to get past that gate, if you will, or that critical moment in the race, then that's what we work on.
Yeah. To that end, if you find the task of like all of the gaps kind of daunting, I think it is worth looking at the event that you have and listing everything that's part of it. And that can be all of the stuff that you're really good at as well. So, the endurance can be part of that, or, the fact that you're super good at like taking in enough fuel and your gut is rock solid, like that can be part of it. That way, this is like that to-do list thing where sometimes you put a thing on the to-do list just to check it off. It does, I think, help when you have like a list of here's, the 15 components of this event. And okay, 7 of them are pretty accounted for, pretty comfortable with those. And then you kind of see which ones are the gaps, but at least that way you don't go into the event feeling like I suck at every part of this.
Well, and the thing too to remember is we just need 1 or 2 things. Some of this can be layered on top. So say you get really nervous before the race. So maybe we'll include what would be like a sports psych thing, like a relaxation or breathing practice. So we're going to do a physiological side, look it up. You can, sniff through your nose a couple times and then breathe out really slow. You're going to do that 4 times before you start your workout. Okay. Or it could be visualization or whatever your mental training is. Then maybe you said nutrition. So you're going to try some of this like higher carb fueling 2 or 3 times a week on your intense and long rides. So there's a nutritional piece. And then, okay, yeah, Peter mentioned the standing starts thing. So I'm going to start every interval for the next 6 weeks is going to be from a standing start, no matter what the actual interval focus is. That's the idea. And maybe in the warm up for my actual intervals, I'm going to also do 3 start simulation type sprint efforts. It's sort of warm up efforts, but also just to include some more start sprints, do the thing more often. And that could be the extent of the limiter. And then you just do whatever the other. So if you're in a threshold block or you like doing sweet spot or whatever your intervals are, you just could do those. But then that's how you could maybe include some of these gaps or limiters into the training process, right? And that's not really, that took like 30 seconds to talk about, right? You put some more sugar in your bottle, you take 2 deep breaths before you start your workout, and then you just start from a standing start. A little annoying, but it'll be second nature after 2 weeks.
Right. Okay.
So that's that. So we have the, thinking about the event, thinking through it, what are the challenges going to be? Because that's going to really inform, especially as we get into the last, 8 weeks before your race. That's where we want to get more specific. So that's going to take care of a lot of what does the training start to look like? Well, it starts looking more like the race on a lot of the, at least for the couple of key sessions of the week, it starts looking more like the race in regardless almost of who you are, right? You could almost think about training as if we are you're a sprinter and I'm a endurance like triathlete type thing. we might start from a little different places to working on our limiters, but at some point we need to almost converge on, yeah, we're both getting ready for Unbound or something, right? We're going to get ready for a 200-mile gravel race. So at some point, those training is going to start looking pretty similar, even though you have two different people you're preparing to try and give them the experiences, right? Did I say you were a sprinter? So if you were a sprinter, maybe you have zero experience riding long. Whereas maybe as an endurance person, maybe I'm not going to be ready for the faster start or the group. Maybe I've never ridden with a group. I'm a triathlete, so I never ride with people. You can see how like what the experiences they need to have in the training are different, but then maybe they're going to converge in that like at some point they're both going to need to do some long gravel bike rides.
Right, right. And again, this is, the same whether or not we're talking about an actual event or, just something you've put on the calendar just to give yourself that thing. And that's partially because training really should undulate throughout the year. So it does make sense, even if you don't have a goal, to have sort of some of these like specific phases.
Mm-hmm.
This is why we say set something as a goal, even if it's not a race.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think so. Yeah. And that could be, again, just a big ride that you're a little nervous about, a big route you've never done, or, for some people, it could be the power test even, right? Or the local Strava hill, the local hill.
For sure.
For some people can be enough too, right? And it's not the most enjoyable thing probably because it's not the thing you necessarily like, but it is a little scary. And then that can help motivate the training that you want to do.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, where next?
Well, I don't know. What else did we have on this list? I think so. We do have testing there. We have task demands. We've talked about that. The race analysis. We've talked through that a little bit here. We talked about those couple frameworks. So I guess the other thing then is just if we talk about field testing, we didn't talk a lot about that. I thought that would be another place where if you weren't sure and you do have a power meter, then you might be able to go and do a few different tests. So this would be power profiling. You could look up if you have training racing with a power meter, the book. That book details this stuff quite extensively. You can probably Google it as well if you look up power profiling. But the idea is to compare sort of short, medium, long, maybe tests, how much power can you produce? And so you can look that up. If you're in Training Peaks, there's a power profile where it compares, I think, your 5 second, 1 minute, 5 minute, 20 minute, and maybe a 60 minute. I think it also does the 60. So you can sort of see, and it ranks them. And what I always say is what you're looking for is just which ones are the lower in relative terms. So it might rate you as, very poor on your sprint is often the case. And then people will, it'll go up and they're 20 minutes because everyone tests their 20 minutes, is it going to be maybe a little higher? So what you can do with that then is it might tell you where you haven't been training, which is sometimes really interesting, right? The other thing that I see with a lot of people is they never do anything hard or maximal, probably even under 5 minutes. So for a lot of people, if you're saying, what should I do in training? Often the answer can be what you've never done before. Right now I'm doing a bit more jumping and plyometric stuff, which is, not rocket science, but it's something I've never included a ton. There you go. I'll probably get a benefit out of it if I don't get injured. This is always the trick. But I'm trying to be slow with it, right? And I'm not someone who sprints very well. I'm not someone who starts very well. I don't think a very fast twitch person, but probably will be great for me. So similarly, what I'll see is with the especially that sprint, so say 5 second, 10 seconds, 15 second sprints, however you want to arrange it in your training, it could be standing starts or rolling into it like a sign sprint type thing. For a lot of people, what that does is it trains this skill and athleticism that they've never really experienced. And we can start lengthening that out even to 5 minutes because these are pretty aggressive, explosive efforts. And so I find a lot of times when people have flat power curves, meaning that they have their 20-minute power is 200 watts, their 5-minute power is 205 watts, their 1 minute power is 210 watts, their 5 second sprint 250. Right. So I see this a lot. And some of it is because they would never sprint. They've been told to sit down. They don't like to do it, whatever the reason is. But if you can this is that raise the roof thing we sort of talked about where you can't raise the 20-minute. Does that make sense mathematically?
Yes.
Right. So if you're 5 minutes, 205, I'm exaggerating, but not by a lot. It's a flat power curve. So if you think about those numbers sort of graphed out, it's flat. So what we would rather see is that person can do 300%, 200 to 300% of their FTP or their 20-minute or whatever, pick whatever you want. So if it's 200, then probably they should be able to hit 400 or 500, more, so that then there's room. If their goal was to get to 210 for 20 minutes, then you have to first do that for 5 minutes, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right. You can't do 20 minutes before you do 5 minutes.
Yeah,
right?
fair enough.
You would have to do this, but this is what you see a lot of times. So it could be physiological, but my argument is always, I think a lot of it is they're just not doing it. And then two, it's a little more aggressive than they want to be on a bicycle, or athletic, if you will, right? Like it takes a lot of coordination to sprint, right? Especially as you start pushing up into 600, 700, 800, 1,000. For a lot of people, this is really, really aggressive and explosive and fast, right? It just takes a lot. Again, this gets back to like, not a lot of us don't jump, a lot of us don't sprint. So I would say for a lot of people, that's an area to really try and ease into and see, because I think what that'll do is just open up this whole new area that your threshold, your all day pace, your whatever will come up, because you're able to now access this. You're able to, maybe you're standing a bit more on the bicycle when needed, which can just be a game changer. Again, not overnight, but this is in 6 weeks. I bet you if you stand a bit more, include sprints a few times a week, I would be very surprised if you don't see those other numbers start to budge.
Perfect.
Yeah. So power profiling, we'll leave that with you as homework if you want to look into it. But the short answer is probably just, maybe a little more sprints and, shorter stuff periodically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, anything else to add, or?
No, hopefully there's enough of a framework there, right? I think the 80% is passing grade and keep doing something. Try and not make it all maximal. That endurance, I think maybe that's the only last thing is too, when we look at your data, is that endurance, we can call it zone 2, but let's just call it endurance, that low intensity. A lot of times what we'll see, especially with the time limited people, is that rough 80-20 split. That's cliche, but again, most of the training process isn't, hard, isn't maximal, isn't moderate. A lot of times that's shifted where there's a lot of time in that middle ground. And so it's a cliche, but it's pretty true too, is like, if you're not making progress anymore, you're feeling tired, you get sick a lot, try and do more time down in that low intensity. It takes a bit of courage. And it's not to say you can't do your sweet spot, but only 1 or 2 days a week for most of us as masters adults are going to be in that sweet spot. This is even Uncle Frank Overton. He would even say, he's gone through a bunch of their sweet spot plans, and he says, no, it basically is that, right? There's a lot of endurance, and then there's the sweet spot and the tempo and the moderate stuff.
Now, when you say 80-20, and this is maybe getting a bit in the weeds, but like when you say 80-20 with that, are you saying 20% should be at that higher intensity, or 20% should be where it's like 1 out of 5 workout? Like,
oh, so there's 2 questions there. So I'm just referring to, and this is the research is mixed on both those questions. There's sort of 2 questions of that. So I'm saying 80% should be easy, and then 20% should be something else. So moderate or hard. This is a little different than polarized, where it's like nothing in the middle. And then they're suggesting that you have 20% up in the very high intensity, 80%. Where, there's sort of diversion, and depending on how you account for it and everything else and the sport. So we're saying most of your time should be easy, and then moderate or hard. So intervals for the rest. And
but with the intervals, if we say you'd have like 5 by 5 minutes at hard with 3 minutes of recovery in between, is the time at hard the 25 minutes, or is it the 40 minutes?
Sure. So that's the second question, is how do you account the 80-20? And so the research is also very mixed, and this really changes it. This is where it gets tricky. So there's the session counting, like the intention of the session, which is what I believe is the way it should go. And this gets to that, how strict you need to be with our endurance training, our zone 2. So we need to be sort of strict, because you only want about 20% of the sessions to be moderate or hard.
Okay. See, that's where I was kind of going with that, because, for me, if I look at my run volume for the week, 25 minutes of it is hard.
Yeah. And then
but I train.
the other wrinkle in the research is, what do you use to account high intensity? Because heart rate could be depressed if someone's like in a cold environment, or if they only do like shorter sprints, maybe they wouldn't get the heart rate up for very long. Yeah, it sort of misses it. And even just the dose, if you did 10 maximal sprints in a workout, you could be very tired for like a week if you really wound it up. But that would be so little if you were, especially if you were counting by heart rate. But even power, think about that, 10 by 10. So that's like 100 seconds.
Mm-hmm. That's what I mean.
And then you go and train, whatever you train, right? 10 hours. So it's really not very much. So yeah, that's where it can't possibly, like 20% becomes a lot unless you're doing, tempo or sweet spot. You could do it that way, but then yeah. So the session counting method, I think, is the way to do it. Mm-hmm. Which again gets to the point where those endurance sessions probably should be relatively strict. Because you don't want those to start creeping into those other sessions, right?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Just wanted to clarify that, because I do think that gets like stressful and confusing, because I hear it and I immediately am like, oh my God, I'm not doing nearly enough intensity. If I think about it in like the most literal sense of the.
Yeah. And it's one of those ones that even if you go back in the research, like a lot of it is looking back on like a world champion's training and their training logs or something. And so it is tricky, because can you do that? That's like looking back. Is that how you would then program forward necessarily? And are you trying to fit stuff into that? Yeah, I don't know. So I would say just double check that you're being careful, that there are endurance sessions in your training. And it's boring. I get it. Right. But that's the thing, is people, the sort of the one note I had here just to finish off, I guess, on this is, most of what you see on Instagram or anything else is going to be the snazzy race result, the high intensity interval thing, the suffer, whatever, the big epic ride that we post. But what's missing a lot of times is just the amount of boring, unremarkable endurance riding, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the sad reality, is that's a lot of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. All right. Let's wrap that question up there and then hit you with a rapid fire. Let's get into heart rate strap troubleshooting.
Okay. Well, I'll try and do this justice. I don't know if I can hold this mic and do this at the same time, but here we go.
Well, here, do you want me to hold your mic?
I don't know. We can try this. Do you want to do it?
Okay. I'll be a mic stand. All right. So this is, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see, if you're listening, we'll talk through it. So you don't really need to stress about going to YouTube. But this is, you're getting ready for a ride and your heart rate strap is not connecting. How do we troubleshoot?
Okay. So key here is to have a Canadian toonie. If you don't know about toonies, you can Google it, but it's our $2 coin. It's got does it still have a polar bear? It does. I think so. Yeah. So polar bear, it's the perfect size to try and get the battery cover off your heart rate strap.
Okay, to be clear, a quarter would work just fine.
But you know what works better? A toonie. In all cases, it's a great coin.
And worth about as much as a quarter if you're doing the American-Canadian conversion.
Okay, so your heart rate strap isn't working. So there's a few things to just sort of double check. It needs to go on the skin. I always check this. A lot of people roll their eyes, but it can't go over your bib strap or over your undershirt. You need to have it right on your skin. Right, these are sort of like electrodes that are going to, need to be moist. So that's our next thing to check, is do you have it moist? Is it fairly tight? Okay, it can be uncomfortable, but you'll get used to it in most cases. You want your heart rate strap, which is around just under sort of where a bra strap would be, or just sort of under your pecs, above your belly, is this heart rate strap. So is it installed correctly? A lot of times we'll say you want the logo, so whatever the brand is, to be upright. It's not always that it matters, but some of them are left-right specific. So just align your logos. We always say that's a good rule of thumb. Your tires, all these things should be aligned. Nice, beautiful logos. Okay, and then cleaning. I'm not big on cleaning mine, but if it isn't working, it is worth giving it a hand scrub with just some soap. You can look this up. I wouldn't necessarily run them through the clothes washer, but a lot of them, the battery covers come off, so you probably could, but I would just hand wash it.
I was going to hand wash, dish soap. Just make sure you rinse it, just especially if you have sensitive skin. You don't really want to have that soap on there. Mm-hmm. So the next thing to do, actually, before you get into all this toonie business, is try it with a different device. Because I think a lot of the time it's actually not the heart rate strap that's acting up. It is your computer, your watch, your phone, whatever. So figure out if you have any other thing in the house that it connects to. A lot of them now are Bluetooth and Ant Plus, so they'll connect to both a cycling computer and your phone.
Sure.
So just do a quick check that it's it is the heart rate strap that's being the issue versus your device. And if it looks like it's the device, restart the device.
Right. And so we can repair. So let's then go. So I have a fresh battery, which is annoying to put in a fresh battery, but this is a good thing to do. And before you do that, I don't know if I can show this on the screen, but there's going to be little, let me put this in here. Yeah. So if you can see, there's like a lot of little metal pieces in there. And so if you visually inspect that, then you can come in and just make sure that the little leads aren't bent or really jiggly. So sometimes you'll see that like the piece of metal actually has snapped off, or it's bent back because maybe, it got installed aggressively, but you want to make sure that those metal pieces are touching the battery. And then I'm going to install my new battery backwards. Some of the heart rate straps, again, we're just trying to be general with this, so this doesn't necessarily matter for all of them, but if you install it backwards and just for 10 seconds, and I'm just going to leave it in there, then what it'll let us do is reset the sensor in some cases. So after I've done that and sort of, what's that called? Like grounding it out, I guess. Then I'll install it the correct way, just gently, making sure that the battery snaps in there. It's pretty firm, like it shouldn't easily fall out if I turn it upside down. Then I'm going to reinstall the cover onto the thing using the Toonie so that I don't strip out the back. Then what we'll do, again, align it with the logo up. So you have a bit of a nice left-right is perfect. And then what we should be able to do is put this on and have it on snugly and have it read well. Now, the only other thing you could go and do a bit of troubleshooting on is get it to pair to your phone and then use the app for the company. So if it's Wahoo or Garmin or whatever, use that to try and update any of the firmware. It's not usually the case, but sometimes these things now that everything's quote unquote smart. So maybe a firmware update could help. But that's sort of our main things is new battery, install it backwards, then install it properly. Make sure that none of the inside metal pieces are broken or jiggly. Put it back on using a Toonie, then align the logo, put it on tightly, right on your skin, and then it should read. Now, if it doesn't, we suggest you might want to look into a new heart rate strap, and we'll put a couple links in our show notes to some of our favorite ones and some of the cheaper ones as well, which seem to work really well.
Okay, dumb follow-up question. Have you ever found someone who it didn't work on them, but then, they give it to their partner or whatever, and it works? Like, should they check it on another person?
I don't know. Some people say that's gross, but I haven't seen that. I had a client ask if hair, like being really hairy, I guess at some point that might, but I've never really seen that over the years.
Well, you don't have a lot of chest hair, so.
Well, not in me. Like, I've just never really seen a client who's like, oh yeah, I have to shave my chest, or that like doesn't work.
If you have a significant amount of chest hair, it could be an issue.
It makes sense.
Be why the heart rate strap would stop working.
If it was working before, yeah, you don't need to necessarily change I wouldn't start there.
Don't shave your chest if it previously worked.
You can, but yeah, I wouldn't start there if it was working before. So the reality is a lot of these things will wear out if you train a lot. It could only be a year or a year and a half. Again, these cheaper ones, which we'll link to, they seem to be lasting as well or better. So we'll link to that in the show notes.
Perfect. All right. We will wrap up there. As always, consummateathlete.com to hit us with any questions, or at consummateathlete on Instagram. And yeah, we're looking for more questions. We have some exciting stuff coming up. And if you like this episode, do us a favor, leave us a rating, review, subscribe, either on the podcast app, on YouTube, pretty much wherever podcasts are found. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we will see you next week.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete podcast. If you want to hear more training, racing, and endurance sport advice, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at consummateathlete.com for a weekly dose of inspiration and advice straight to your inbox.